Lady Chatterley's Lover, the continuation of Lady Chatterley's Lover with me, Morel Benard. I think my last words were, "Good night, Clifford. Do you sleep well? The Racine gets into one like a dream. Good night." She had drifted to the door. She was going without kissing him good night. He watched her with sharp, cold eyes, so she did not even kiss him good night after he had spent an evening reading to her. Such depths of callousness. Even if the kiss was but a formality, it was on such formalities that life depends. She was a Bolshevik, really. Her instincts were Bolshevistic. He gazed coldly and angrily at the door when she had gone. Anger. And again the dread of the night came to him. He was a network of nerves, and he was not braced up to work, and so full of energy, or when he was not listening in and so utterly neuter. Then he was haunted by anxiety and a sense of dangerous impending void. He was afraid, and Connie could keep the fear off him if she would. But it was obvious she wouldn't. She was callous, cold and callous to all that he did for her. He gave up his life for her, and she was callous to him. She only wanted her own way. The lady loves her will. Now it was a baby she was obsessed by, just so that it should be her own, all her own, and not his. Clifford was so healthily considering. He looked so well and ruddy in the face. His shoulders were broad and strong, his chest deep. He had put on flesh, and yet at the same time he was afraid of death. A terrible hollow seemed to menace him somewhere, somehow a void, and into this void his energy would collapse. Energyless. He felt at times he was dead, really dead. So his rather prominent, pale eyes had a queer look, furtive and yet a little cruel, so cold, and at the same time almost impudent. It was a very odd look, this look of impudence, as if he were triumphing over life in spite of life. Who knowest the ministries of life? For it can triumph even after the angels. But his dread was the night when he could not sleep. Then it was awful indeed. When annihilation pressed in on him on every side, then it was ghastly to exist without having any life, lifeless in the night to exist. But now he could ring for Mrs. Bolton, and she would always come. That was a great comfort. She would come in her dressing gown, with her hair in a plait down her back, curiously girlish and dim, though the brown plait was streaked with grey. And she would make him coffee or chamomile tea, and she would play chess or piquet with him. She had a woman's queer faculty of playing even chess well enough, when she was 3 parts asleep, well enough to make her worth beating. So in the silent intimacy of the night she sat, and he lay on the bed, with a reading lamp, shedding its solitary light on them. She almost gone in sleep, he almost gone in a sort of fear, and they played together. Then they had a cup of coffee and a biscuit together, hardly speaking in the silence of night, but being a reassurance to one another. And this night she was wondering who Lady Chatterley's lover was. And she was thinking of her own Ted, so long dead, yet for her never quite dead. And when she thought of him, the old grudge against the world rose up, but especially against the masters, that they had killed him. They had not really killed him, yet to her emotionally they had. And somewhere, deep in herself because of it, she was a nihilist, and really anarchic. In her half-sleep, thoughts of her Ted and thoughts of Lady Chatterley's unknown lover commingled, and then she felt she shared with the other woman a great grudge against Sir Clifford and all he stood for. At the same time, she was playing piquet with him, and they were gambling sixpences, and it was a source of satisfaction to be playing piquet with a baronet, and even losing sixpences to him. When they played cards, they always gambled. It made him forget himself, and he usually won. Tonight, too, he was winning, so he would not go to sleep till the first dawn appeared. Luckily, it began to appear at 4:30 or thereabouts. Connie was in bed and fast asleep all this time, but the keeper, too, could not rest. He had closed the coops and made his round of the wood, then gone home and eaten supper, but he did not go to bed. Instead, he sat by the fire and thought. He thought of his boyhood in Tevershall, and of his 5 or 6 years of married life. He thought of his wife, and always bitterly. She'd seemed so brutal, but he had not seen her now since 1915. In the spring when he joined up, yet there she was, not 3 miles away, and more brutal than ever. He hoped never to see her again while he lived. He thought of his life abroad as a soldier, India, Egypt, then India again, the blind, thoughtless life with the horses, the colonel who had loved him and whom he had loved, the several years he had been an officer, a lieutenant with a very fair chance of being a captain, then the death of the colonel from pneumonia, and his own narrow escape from death, his damaged health, his deep restlessness, his leaving the army and coming back to England to be a working man again. He was temporizing with life. He had thought he would be safe at least for a time in this wood. There was no shooting as yet. He had to rear the pheasants. He would have no gun to serve. He would be alone and apart from life, which was all he wanted. He had to have some sort of a background, and this was his native place. There was even his mother, though she had never meant very much to him. And he could go on in life existing from day to day without connection and without hope, for he did not know what to do with himself. He did not know what to do with himself since he had been an officer for some years and had mixed among the other officers and civil servants with their wives and families. He had lost all ambition to get on. There was a toughness, a curious rubberneck toughness and unlivingness about the middle and upper classes as he had known them, which just left him feeling cold and different from them. So he had come back to his own class, to find there what he had forgotten during his absence of years. A pettiness and a vulgarity of manner extremely distasteful. He admitted now at last how important manner was. He admitted also how important it was even to pretend not to care about the halfpence and the small things of life. But among the common people there was no pretense. A penny more or less on the bacon was worse than a change in the gospel. He could not stand it. And again, there was the wage squabble. Having lived among the owning classes, he knew the utter futility of expecting any solution of the wage squabble. There was no solution short of death. The only thing was not to care about the wages. Yet, if you were poor and wretched, you had to care. Anyhow, it was becoming the only thing they did care about. The care about money was like a great cancer eating away the individuals of all classes. He refused to care about money. And what then? What did life offer apart from the care of money? Nothing. Yet he could live alone. in the one satisfaction of being alone, and raise pheasants to be shot ultimately by fat men after breakfast. It was futility to the ninth power. But why care? Why bother? And he had not cared nor bothered till now, when this woman had come into his life. He was nearly 10 years older than she, and he was 1,000 years older in experience, starting from the bottom. The connection between them was growing closer. He could see the day when it would clinch up and they would have to make a life together. For the bonds of love are ill to loose. And what then? What then? Must he start again with nothing to start on? Must he entangle this woman? Must he have the horrible broil with her lame husband, and also some sort of horrible broil with his own brutal wife who hated him? Misery, lots of misery. And he was no longer young and merely buoyant. Neither was he the insouciant sort. Every bitterness and every ugliness would hurt him and the woman. But even if they got clear of Sir Clifford and of his own wife, even if they got clear, what were they going to do? What was he himself going to do? What was he going to do with his life? For he must do something. He couldn't be a mere hanger-on her money and his own very small pension. It was the insoluble. He could only think of going to America to try a new air. He disbelieved in the dollar utterly, but perhaps there was something else. He could not rest, nor even go to bed. After sitting in a stupor of bitter thoughts until midnight, he got suddenly from his chair and reached for his coat and gun. "Come on, lass," he said to the dog. "We're best outside." It was a starry night, but moonless. He went on a slow, scrupulous, soft steeping and steadily round. The only thing he had to contend with was the colliers setting snares for rabbits, particularly the Stacks Gates colliers on the Merhay side. But it was breeding season, and even colliers respected it a little. Nevertheless, the stealthy beating of a round in search of poachers soothed his nerves and took his mind off his thoughts. But when he had done his slow, cautious beating of his bounds, it was nearly a 5-mile walk, he was tired. He went to the top of the knoll and looked out. There was no sound save the noise, the faint, shuffling noise from Stack's Gate collier that never ceased working, and there were hardly any lights save the brilliant electric rose at the works. The world lay darkly and fumingly sleeping. It was 2:30. But even in its sleep it was an uneasy, cruel world, stirring with the noise of a train or some great lorry on the road, and flashing with some rosy lightning flash from the furnaces. It was a world of iron and cold, the cruelty of iron and the smoke of coal, and the endless greed that drove it all. Only greed stirring in its sleep. It was cold, and he was coughing. A fine cold draught blew over the knoll. He thought of the woman. Now he would have given all he had, or ever might have, to hold her warm in his arms, both of them wrapped in one blanket, and sleep. All hopes of eternity, and all gain from the past he would have given to have her there, to be wrapped warm with him in one blanket, and sleep, only sleep. It seemed the sleep with a woman in his arms was the only necessity. He went to the hut and wrapped himself in the blanket and lay on the floor to sleep. But he could not, he was cold. And besides, he felt cruelly his own unfinished nature. He felt his own unfinished condition of aloneness cruelly. He wanted her to touch her, to hold her fast against him in one moment of completeness and sleep. He got up again and went out, towards the park gates this time, then slowly along the path, towards the house. It was nearly 4 o'clock, still clear and cold, but no sign of dawn. He was used to the dark. He could see well. Slowly, slowly, the great house drew him as a magnet. He wanted to be near her. It was not desire, not that. It was a cruel sense of unfinished aloneness that needed a silent woman folded in his arms. Perhaps he could find her. Perhaps he could even call her out to him or find some way to her. For the need was imperious. He slowly, silently climbed the incline to the hall. Then he came round the great trees at the top of the knoll onto the drive which made a grand sweep round a loxodon of grass in front of the entrance. He could already see the two magnificent beeches which stood in this big level loxodon in front of the house, detaching themselves darkly in the dark air. There was the house, low and long and obscure, with one light burning downstairs in Sir Clifford's room. But which room she was in? The woman who held the other end of the frail thread which drew him so mercilessly that he did not know. He went a little nearer, gun in hand, and stood motionless on the drive watching the house. Perhaps even now he could find her, come at her in some way. The house was not impregnable. He was as clever as burglars are. Why not come to her? He stood, motionless, waiting, while the dawn faintly and imperceptibly paled behind him. He saw the light in the house go out, but he did not see Mrs. Bolton come to the window and draw back the old curtain of dark blue silk and stand herself in the dark room, looking out on the half-dark of the approaching day, looking for the longed-for dawn, waiting for Clifford to be really reassured that it was daybreak. For when he was sure of daybreak, he would sleep almost at once. She stood blind with sleep at the window, waiting. And as she stood, she started and almost cried out. For there was a man out there on the drive, a black figure in the twilight. She woke up greyly and watched, but without making a sound to disturb Sir Clifford. The daylight began to rustle into the world, and the dark figure seemed to grow smaller and more defined. She made out the gun, and gaiters, and baggy jacket. It would be Oliver Mellors, the keeper. Yes, for there was the dog, nosing around like a shadow, and waiting for him. And what did the man want? Did he want to rouse the house? What was he standing there for, transfixed, looking up at the house like a love-sick male dog outside the house where the bitch is? Goodness. The knowledge went through Mrs. Bolton like a shot. He was Lady Chatterley's lover. He. Well. Mrs. Bolton. Whoa. She knows what's going on. Or she thinks she knows what's going on. Please listen to the next video. Listen to the next video of Lady Chatterley's lover. Listen to the next video of Lady Chatterley's lover. You've been listening to Morel Benard. See you the next video of Lady Chatterley's lover. For now.